Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to the next Eternal set review part for the Dusk Road with all the shadow cards. So without further ado, let's get right to it. Okay, so first we have the Amethyst Waystone, a Waystone that I think is a candidate for the worst one alongside the Justice one, simply because I think the card is mostly bad unless you are a very proactive, possibly Nightfall centered deck. Like, it might be good enough in Shadow aggro decks like Stone Sky aggro, for example, might actually want this simply because, you know, it makes it easier to finish off the opponent. If your opponent is on a slower deck like a mid-range or control deck, giving them that extra card doesn't matter that much, dealing them that 1 damage can kill them, and so on. So I can see this becoming like a 4-off in an aggressive deck that runs enough power, since the problem is aggressive decks also are hurt the most by this not being a sigil, since they really need their seeds to be ready power sources on turn 1 every time if possible. But yeah, this is the only deck where I can see this outside of, say, like a Feln Nightfall centric deck basically. Otherwise this Nightfall is just such a two-edged sword that you don't really want to put it in your deck. Like, half the time it will be like even worse for you than for your opponent. So it's just, yeah. And in limited, kind of the same as with all Waystones. Fine to put them in, but nothing to be aggressively going for. Next we have Affliction. This is mostly a role player. Like, in Constructed it's not great, but it is decent. First of all, having a 1-cost cheap removal in Shadow aside from Suffocate that has some different applications and some curse synergies is nice. So this kind of deals with some stuff and has synergy with, say, there's this one for Unseen Flyer for 3 that if you play a curse it gets +2 attack permanently. So this is a pretty nice card to synergize with that, for example. And it's reasonably flexible in the sense that it can still virtually kill a threat by crippling it to a point where it doesn't really do any harm anymore. But yeah, at best like a niche role player in Constructed. In Limited, sort of similar. It's a decent card, nothing great, but a fine filler, and yeah, rounds out the deck potentially. Like, the -2 attack is enough to shut down a bunch of evasive attackers that might otherwise cause you trouble, for example. Then we have Arachnophobia, pretty bad curse, really. Once again, 1-cost, Nightfall. I said enough about Nightfall at this point, I think. And then all you get is basically a delayed Deadly Spider. Delayed Direfang Spider, basically. So the question here is, why would you put this in your deck over a Direfang Spider, and also why would you put a Direfang Spider in your Constructed deck? So yeah, not a good card, and even in Limited, I think, unless you really need another Nightfall enabler, this is pretty bad, because Direfang Spider is fine in Draft, but I think a bad Direfang Spider is probably too bad for Draft. Then we have Grena Mender, basically the Shadow counterpart to Ticking Grenade in. Yeah, well, it's basically just that. It's Ticking Grenade in, but instead of dealing 3 to the opponent, it gains you 3. Which is nice, because some of these sacrifice-oriented decks, Grenade and sacrifice-oriented decks, are much more grindy and utility and defensive-oriented, so that gaining 3 health is often much more relevant to the deck than dealing 3 to the opponent. So this might actually be a decent card, especially also with how well it pairs up against aggro. It trades with their 1-drops and gains a 3 health. That's a pretty good deal. And in Limited, it's probably mostly going to be just too weak without the synergies going on that it is really playable. Next we have Stone Scar Sneak. Kind of an interesting card. Once again, we have a 1/1 for 1 with some utility. Sure, he has Quick Draw, not particularly relevant. Sure, makes him a decent weapon carrier and all, but you'll probably have better targets to use your weapons on than a 1/1 quick draw. So he's mostly there for the ability and for the gunslinger synergies like gunslinger ally and stuff. But the ability is kind of nice. The problem is at 3 and exhausting him, it's a bit expensive for what it does, but +3 attack and quick draw is also pretty strong. It means most units that you will use this on are virtually unblockable. Like for example, imagine this being used on, say, a fully active Champion of Chaos. It's gonna be an 8/3 overwhelm deadly quick draw that's like impossible to block. So it can really cause some trouble if there's a bit of a standoff or your units are getting outclassed, and it's still a 1-drop that does some stuff on its own. So yeah, this card is kind of interesting. It's a little weak, but there might be some use for it. And in limited, this is actually pretty good. Like this ability is quite the stall breaker, and I can really see this being worth it to put in a deck, trying to like stall out the board a bit and then use this guy to just harass the opponent to death. Next we have Trusty Revolver. In Constructed, this card is basically mostly overshadowed by Jack's Knife, since it's just a better effect for cost ratio. Sure, the 2 damage that you take are a bit annoying, but in an aggressive deck, it's still going to be better to just have more impactful stats. The one upside this has is that it creates 2 weapons for cards that care about weapons, which is nice. But I think ultimately, if you put a 1-cost weapon in a deck, it's usually going to be Jack's Knife, not this one. And in limited, it's kind of weak, like the +1 is low impact. It's basically a bad ornamental daggers. But if you need some weapons to turn on some weapon abilities, this might be a fine filler if you have enough cards to synergize with it. Then we have the next intervention, Varus Intervention. First, you give an enemy unit permanently -1 health. Spell speed, not fast spell speed, makes it a bit worse, but it basically deals with all the 1-drops and even some more, so that's nice, or can help you like finish off a unit and so on, so it has some nice utility there already. Then giving one of your units unblockable this turn can come in handy with like Infiltrate or just killing a relic weapon or simply ending the game. And if you play enough Unseen, then the card becomes reasonably playable, since then you also get a weak Dark Return for Unseens. So yeah, once you have Unseens in your deck, this card is actually very playable. Without Unseens in your deck, the -1 health and the unblockability might not be enough to cut it, really. And in limited, sort of the same. Once you have a bunch of Unseens, this card's pretty appealing, because the other 2 effects are good enough, even though situational, to matter, and if they don't come up, you can always just trade it for a random unit, which is fine. Next we have Wisplight, another 1-drop, a 0/1 flying for 1. Sorry about that. And once per turn you can pay 2 to give Wisplight +2 attack this turn. So basically, yeah, you can just conditionally turn this into a 2/1 flyer on offense, which is like a super bad deal. It's super slow. In limited, it might be okay if you have some synergies with it, like putting weapons on it or other buffs, and yeah, you eventually might have the spare power to just use this as a 2/1 flyer constantly to attack. It's not something that I want to put in my deck, but I can see decks where this might end up as one of the last cards going in. Next we have Battlefield Scavenger, the promo card, the preview card for Shadow from the event. This is actually a pretty neat package. I really liked it in the event. A 1/3 makes for a pretty relevant blocker. The Warcry makes it still a relevant attacker. The ultimate at 5 is very reasonably costed and gives you a free card effectively, and adding Warcry to that card is not super relevant, especially at the point in time it happens, but it's a nice bonus. So a pretty well-rounded card that I can easily see going into Valkyrie heavy Argent Port constructed decks of a more mid-rangey to grindy nature. And in limited, I mean, Minotaur Grunt is already a pretty good 2-drop, and this is just that much better really, even with only a few Valkyries in the deck. Next we have Corrupt. This is a super sweet one and a card that I'm really surprised at how cheap it is. You get to steal an enemy's spell played on you or one of your units and redirect it to the enemy. So you basically get to counter their removal and kill their best unit with it. Or counter their, I don't know, sabotage and sabotage them. This card is a stone cold 2-power 2-for-1, as long as you get a decent target. And the fact that it steals it is that much better than how these cards work in Magic, since it doesn't need to be targeted. Like for example, a Channel the Tempest says deal damage equal to the cards in your hand to target X, draw three cards and then deal X damage to target X. So the card draw is not targeted. So basically in Magic, if you would redirect it, you would just change the target of the damage and the opponent would still draw 3 cards. If you corrupt it, however, you get to draw 3 cards, your hand becomes the source of the damage, and you get to choose what to damage. This card is just gonna be a nightmare, especially in tournament play, sideboard, best of 3 games. This is just, yeah, this card is super scary and powerful, and might easily be good enough to make it in main decks as like a one-off, at least in like mid-range and control decks, for example. This card is really sweet. And powerful. And yeah, unlimited blowout potential, great card. There will usually be enough targets to make it worth it, so I'm fairly happy to put one of these in my draft decks, I think. Next we have Cowardice. So the nice thing here is this is basically a 2-power Death Strike on offense, so if you are like a hyper-aggressive deck like Gidolis, this removes blockers indiscriminately of what kind of unit they are, what abilities they have aside from Aegis, and also does so permanently and for 2 power. So if you really don't care about getting attacked back, this is an insanely awesome removal, and it also happens to be a curse that synergizes with cards like Mirror's Nightblade, for example. So yeah, pretty good card in the right deck, otherwise unplayable. In limited, sort of the same. If your deck is not hyper aggressive, I would not want this in my draft deck, because it's just too single-minded. But in a dedicated aggressive draft deck, this is great. And last but not least for the first part, we have Dream Snatcher, 2-cost 2/3. Double Shadow makes it a bit taxing on turn 2, unfortunately. But we get a 2/3 lifesteal unit, so a nice life force enabler if we want to. And when the enemy player discards a non-power card, Dream Snatcher gets +1 attack, so nice synergy with cards like Sabotage. Like if you play 4 Sabotage and 4 of this guy in a deck, it's pretty nice because you just often can turn this into a 3/3, especially if you can maybe also play like some Varus choices or something like that to make it even more likely for this to grow. Because as soon as this becomes a 3/3 lifesteal for 2, it's pretty great. It's already pretty decent the way it is. And then the ultimate makes it more relevant in the super late game against control decks and super grindy opponents, because you can sometimes just mill them out if you ultimate like 2 of these guys. And in limited, I mean, not much to say. A 2/3 is already nice. A 2/3 with lifesteal is better. A 2/3 with lifesteal that can grow and also has some potentially relevant ultimate. Remember, milling 15 in a 45 card size format is that much more powerful. So yeah, pretty appealing card in both formats aside from the mildly taxing influence requirements of Double Shadow on 2. But yeah, a nice card. Alright, that's it for the first part of the Shadow cards. We're gonna continue with the second part in a moment, so don't go anywhere, stay tuned.